Good evening and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, The Painter's Fire with Zara Anishanslin. We welcome everyone here in person and also those of you who are attending virtually as we live stream this program. We are coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc community who remain a vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs. And though many of you may know, you may not all be aware that our mission here as a national research library is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, which is grounded in the primary sources that we've been collecting, and we continue to collect since our founding in 1812. We foster a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and support of scholarship. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the country, around the world, and from right here in Worcester to use our collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like this one that provide insights into the past and resonance for our own day. And that is certainly true for this evening's program, which features little-known artists and patriotism of the American Revolution. You can learn more about the AAS and about our collections and programs on our website at americanantiquarian.org. As a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep our work going, and we thank you for that. Please note that tonight's program is being recorded, and you can watch recording of all of our programs on our YouTube channel, and you can access those through our website as well. And for those of you who are in the room with us, please do silence your devices so that we can avoid any potential distraction from those. So here's the plan for this evening. Zara will present, and then she and I will engage in conversation for a few minutes, and then we will open things up for your questions. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Zara Anishanslin is Associate Professor of History and Art History at the University of Delaware. She specializes in early American and Atlantic world history with a focus on 18th century material culture. She is the author of the award-winning Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, published by Yale in 2016. In addition to teaching courses in history, art history, and material culture, she is an active public historian with professional and pedagogical experience in museum studies and historic preservation. To my mind, she is a model for the way scholars should share their knowledge and engage with the public realm. She has served as a historical consultant for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as for Lin-Manuel Miranda's history exhibit, Hamilton, the Exhibition. She is a creator and co-host of the history podcast, Thing for Things, which has just launched its first season. And the next season, the title of the next season, she tells me, is The Stuff of Magic. So keep an eye out for the Thing for Things history podcast. Zara was a Jay and Deborah Last Fellow here at the AAS back in 2013. We are delighted to have her back here to present on her brand new book, The Painter's Fire, A Forgotten History of the Artists Who Championed the American Revolution, which was just published earlier this month by Harvard University Press. And that is also the title of her talk this evening. Please welcome Zara Anishanslin.
Thank you so much, Nan. That was so kind and eloquent, as you always are. And thank you, Scott Casper, for hosting, and Nate and is Lauren in here. Thank you for your assistance as well, and all of you, of course, for giving up your evening to be with me and the amazing people I'm going to talk about from the 18th century. I did also want to echo what Nan said about me being a fellow at the AAS and saying that this is a wonderful place to do a fellowship, as many of you in the room know, not least because it's interdisciplinary. And so, you know, when art historians and lit scholars get to talk together, exciting things happen. And I have to say one thing in particular was that I asked the intrepid staff here if I could look at every single almanac published from 1763 to 1783, and not only did they accommodate me, but, you know, they did so in spectacular fashion. So can't recommend the AAS enough, and I'm glad to be back. But so tonight I'm talking about The Painter's Fire, and I like to start with the cover, which I had nothing to do with. But I love it because it allows me to embarrass my Gen Z children, as I love to do. It's one of my hobbies, by saying this cover is fire. So, built-in embarrass your children joke. But one of the things that I love about this cover, and I'll go into this more in greater detail later on in the talk, is that the title itself is an homage to Phyllis Wheatley. And it is a riff on the line in her poem to SM, a young African artist, upon seeing his work, in which she references the painter's and the poet's fire. And so this book is about how creative people help to fuel revolutions, how they provide the spark that lights the flame, that creates liberty, not just in the past, but in the present too. And so this history of art and politics in the American Revolution does take us to New England. Promise, I'll get us to Massachusetts. And it does get us to the things we choose to collect and display in archives and museums and historic sites, like the archives at the American Antiquarian Society. But a little contrarily, I'm going to start with a piece of art that no longer exists. And it no longer exists because it was most likely lost at sea off the coast of Maine. And I'm not going to begin in Massachusetts or Virginia or Philadelphia or any of the usual suspects, but in London. More precisely, in London's Royal Academy of Art, which you see in a later depiction here, but this is how it would have looked in the year 1780 that I'm taking us to begin. So picture the scene. The Royal Academy of Arts in London, 1780, crowded with pictures from ceiling to floor, including new portraits of King George and Queen Charlotte on the right by Benjamin West. Among the other paintings was the debut painting entry by 22-year-old Joseph Wright, a promising award-winning Royal Academy student, notable for being one of the first and few Americans to study there. This was his first splash onto the art scene, and although his painting was just one of many portraits in the show, it was one of the most widely remarked upon pieces that year. His entry showed his famous mother, wax sculptor Patience Wright, who you see on the left, modeling a head on her lap. Now, she was a famous figure not least for the titillating way in which she modeled her wax heads. Onlookers said that she would model them under her skirt while she looked at the subject, and then she would pull it out fully formed and have it on the lap. Now, anyone who's done any artistic production knows this is probably not true. Really hard to model a sculpture under your skirts. But she was famous for this, and so her image was very well known. So everyone knew that Joseph Wright's painting was of his mother. And in this case, she was modeling a head while busts of King George and Queen Charlotte, who themselves were in the show, not just in portrait fashion, but physically themselves too for opening night, they looked on. And what she held on her lap was not just any head, it was the decapitated head of King Charles I. England's king famously decapitated by his own subjects during the English Civil War. And it was, as everyone who saw it knew, a picture of regicide and the threat of regicide with the current king and queen looking on. Not surprisingly, it created a sensation, but reactions to the portrait varied widely. And when I stumbled across these in the archives in the Royal Academy in London, I found this fascinating because bear in mind, this is 5 years into the war in terms of fighting. And while some called it an insult to decency, even treasonous, the inspiration for Joseph Wright's self-portrait, which became popularized as a print that same year, in which he self-styled himself as Yankee Doodle or the American Satan. Some did call it an insult to decency and treasonous, but others said it should be saluted as an entertaining defense of constitutional liberties. And so I think these mixed opinions and its remarkable presence at London's Royal Academy at all remind us that the war we now call the American Revolution was fought on both sides of the Atlantic by artists as well as soldiers, and in the courts of public opinion as well as on the battlefield. But art, like many things, does not always survive the havoc of history, and this is meant to be evocative of that absence. What's preserved in our museums is only a really small bit of what was once created and seen. Wright's portrait of his mother, for example, survives only in archival documentation like letters and newspapers. The portrait itself must be imagined. It cannot be seen. It likely, as I mentioned, was lost at sea. In 1781, Joseph Wright left London for Paris. You might imagine why. And then in 1782, with the help of the Wright's family friend, Benjamin Franklin, made plans to return to the United States, sailing on a Boston-bound ship. After a 10-week journey, battling gusts of snow-filled wind on its last day at sea, the ship approached the Maine coast and ran aground on a pile of rocks. Although the passengers managed to make it ashore, much of the ship's cargo, including Wright's paintings, was lost, washed out of the ship's hold, or sunk below the waves. So Joseph Wright's portrait of his mother, holding the decapitated head of Charles I, may have sunk under the Atlantic. But though it is physically lost, it offers an invaluable window into the revolutionary past, and I think a really great metaphor for the fact that much as we can dive to retrieve shipwrecked things from the bottom of the sea, we can tell histories that allow us to see previously submerged stories about the past. Just because they're submerged or hidden doesn't mean they're not there. And in The Painter's Fire, I bring these revolutionary portraits up from the depths of the past and into the light. This allows us to see a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution and the creative people who made it, one that transforms the way we think of the nature of patriotism, then and now. Now, this art and these artists are important to this story because the revolution was not only fought in the colonies with muskets and bayonets. I just created a new weapon, a bayonet. It sounds exciting. On both sides of the Atlantic, artists armed with paint, canvas, and wax played an integral role in forging revolutionary ideals. From London to Boston, from Jamaica to Paris, and from Bath to Philadelphia, these largely forgotten patriots boldly risked their reputations and sometimes their lives to declare independence. At the center of The Painter's Fire are the lives of three of these remarkable artists: Robert Edge Pine, Prince Demah, and Patience Wright, Joseph Wright's mother. In part because of who they were, women, men of color, enslaved and free, and Britons living in England, these patriot artists were mostly excluded from formal political or military power. Instead, they fired salvos against the king on the walls of the Royal Academy, as well as on the battlefields of North America. And they used their talents to inspire rebellion, define American patriotism, and eventually fashion a new political culture. And together, I think their experiences testify both to the promise and to the limitations of liberty in the founding era and beyond. So a snapshot look at each of them to get us started. On the left, you see an image of George Washington by Robert Edge Pine, an award-winning British artist rumored to be of African descent, who infused massive history paintings with politics and eventually loved the United States so much that he emigrated here after the war, where he opened America's first grand art museum in Philadelphia. Apologies to Charles Wilson Peale, but that is true, and I'll get into that later. Prince Demah, whose work you see on the right, was the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in America and Pine's pupil in London before self-emancipating and enlisting to fight for the patriot cause in Massachusetts. And Patience Wright, whose full-length statue of William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, you see in the middle, was a Long Island-born wax sculptor who became a sensation in London and loudly advocated for revolution while acting as an informal patriot spy. So together, they, their families, and their larger networks, which included more famous revolutionary figures like Paul Revere, Ben Franklin, John and Abigail Adams, George and Martha Washington, and Phyllis Wheatley, give us a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution that's fascinating, complex, creative, bizarre, and just like a lot of artists then and now, my most serious historical term I'm going to use all night, wackadoodle. So Robert Edge Pine was friends with and painted many of the heroes of the little r Republican cause, the radical Whig cause in London, including Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay, whose portrait of her you see on the left, where she's posed as a Roman senator in a toga, leaning against a stack of her iconic and rabidly pro-Republican multi-volume history of Britain. And on the right, you see his portrait of John Wilkes, the famous radical Whig politician imprisoned, among other things, for seditious libel against the king and his ministers without habeas corpus and due process. And both of these people are famous and beloved on both sides of the Atlantic among the same types of people who were drawn to the American Revolutionary cause. Now, both of these portraits get made into prints. They also get made into ceramics. John Wilkes has a snuff box of Pine's portrait of him on it. And so these are the images. When people think of Catherine Macaulay and John Wilkes in the Revolutionary era, what they're often thinking of are the images created by Robert Edge Pine. Now, Robert Edge Pine, as I mentioned, was also widely rumored to be of African descent. Here you see an image of his father, engraver John Pine, by his friend William Hogarth. He was a fellow Mason with Hogarth, held royal appointments to George II, and ran a print shop on St. Martin's Lane. So in other words, Robert Edge Pine comes from a massively well-connected family of award-winning British artists, and they are all centered in St. Martin's Lane, In fact, you see the Pine House either in the top right corner or the one right beyond it. And it's important there in St. Martin's Lane because St. Martin's Lane bustled with artists and artisans, women as well as men. Robert Edge Pine's wife was a portrait painter, although not a single one of her attributed paintings survived. They had 5 daughters. At least 2 or 3 of those daughters were artists themselves too. And so this is a place in which many people, not just the men, are practicing artists. You also have sculptors, you have engravers, you have frame makers, and you have cabinet makers, including famous ones like Thomas Chippendale. So their skills and shops make St. Martin's Lane famous. And I like to dwell on this because this is where Prince Demah, then called Prince Demah Barnes, enslaved former sailor living in Marlborough, Massachusetts, where he's one of only 5 enslaved people, finds himself training with award-winning artist Robert Edge Pine in 1770 and 1771. So imagine what a heady change this is from Boston, much less Marlborough. And whereas John Singleton Copley in Boston had refused to train Demah on account of his race, Pine worked with Demah without charge on account of his genius. And I think also it was because they shared this heritage of African descent. And while training Demah, Pine was working on the painting that this print was based on, a 1771 painting of a then famous scene of a scene from the year 1278 in which the Earl of Warenne defended his right against arbitrary seizure of property by a tyrannical king. So you might imagine that this would resonate in 1771 on both sides of the Atlantic, and in fact, the fact that a print even exists is testament to its popularity. So the political decisions that Demah and Pine both make later makes me really want to be a fly on the wall because they had to have discussed politics while they were working on this. And Pine would have been working on this and using it to train Demah when Demah was with him in St. Martin's Lane. And even though Demah's enslaver, Christian Barnes, whom you see pictured here in a portrait that he did of her, likely a copy of a Copley, even though Christian Barnes wrote that she wanted to believe that Prince, or as she called him, her Black Hogarth, was of Tory principles, mostly because, quote, he was born in our family, she confessed, of that I am not quite so certain, as he has not yet declared himself. So Christian's comment, which is a fascinating one in and of itself, points to Prince's diplomatic skills at negotiating the complication of sharing a household with his enslavers who are also his would-be art patrons. And understanding both his artistic and political paths starts in the Barnes' household, but not, I think, because of his enslavement per se. I don't think the fact that he was enslaved is or should be seen as the most interesting thing about him. In fact, I think that it was his mother, Daphne, who was born in Africa and stolen from there as a young girl, like Phyllis Wheatley, who badgered Christian Barnes to purchase her son, who'd been sold away from her when he was a young boy, because of his talents. She wanted him to, get the training that she wanted mostly to be reunited with her son. And so Daphne is persistent, and it works. And the Barneses buy Prince Demah, probably from her brother, and he enters their household and is training first with Christian Barnes and then in London with Robert Edge Pine. Now, I think one of the reasons that Prince Demah might have been circumspect about his political points of view is that the Barneses are very complicated people, like all people, but I think they're a great reminder that people are not black and white in the past or today. So Christian Barnes, is it admirable that she wants to train this enslaved man because she sees his talents? Sure. Less admirable, in fact, repugnant, is the fact that in addition to Daphne and Prince, there's a third enslaved person in the Barnes' household, a woman called Juliet. Juliet is allowed to marry, not legally, of course, but, de facto, marry another enslaved man who lives nearby called Jack. This is something of a romantic pet project for Christian Barnes. When the two are pregnant with their first child, she lets Juliet, with Daphne's midwife skills, give birth in her best bed in the Barnes' household. When the baby is born, however, she says, sufficient to the day is the evil thereof, and either sells or gives away the baby. She doesn't want to have the baby in the household. When Juliet has the nerve to get pregnant a second time, and it's obvious from the letters that Christian writes when the baby is born that Jack is not the father because the baby's complexion is different than the first baby's, implying, based on Juliet and Jack's reaction, they want to stay together regardless, and they're both upset about this child. I think that Juliet was raped by a white man. When the baby is born, not only does Christian sell the baby, but Juliet too, severing the family. And so, given the circumstance, you can imagine why Prince Demah would keep his silence about his political point of view. But time would tell, of course, that Prince Demah was not, in fact, of Tory principles. And by contrast, though, Christian and her husband Henry, who you see here in his portrait by Prince Demah, were staunch Tories. And theirs was a household where politics center stage. And here I can say I kind of admire the fact they're not hypocrites. They stick to their political guns. Henry Barnes is always one of a small handful of Boston area merchants who refuses to sign a non-importation agreement. Much easier to sign it and then do what you want to do. He refuses. So he is an easy target. He's one of a handful of Boston area merchants singled out in town meetings. His name is published in newspapers. And then in June of 1770, right before he and Prince Demah go to London, things take a dramatic turn. One night, men broke windows at the Pearl Ash Works that Barnes operated. Christian Barnes thought they were motivated by greed because, in addition to breaking the windows, they attacked a wagon full of goods, including pepper, that the Barneses owned. And after, as she recounted, they let it all go. They cut the bags, let it all fall out to the street, then gathered it up into their hands and hats and carried off the rest. But the next day, things took a darker turn when someone hung an effigy with a paper pinned to its breast that called Henry an infamous importer, hung it on a hill within sight of their house, and then burned it that night. That same night, local patriots stole someone's horse from a nearby stable, tarred the horse, its saddle and bridle, mounted another effigy on its back, and set him loose around the town with a paper pinned to the breast, which was summed up with wishing us all in hell, as the Barneses remembered. Now, this is the only recorded instance of an animal being tarred and feathered in the American Revolutionary era. And if you can imagine the lasting impression it made on the people who saw it, this explains in part, I think, why the Barneses do not stick around to see the revolution get much worse as things progress over time. Christian Barnes, among other things, is held up at gunpoint in their own house. And so they eventually relocate to England and never come back to the United States. But for those of us looking back in time, I think it's also a chilling reminder of the violence simmering below the surface. That the American Revolution, that it's not the same violence as the French Revolution with the guillotine working overtime. It's not the same violence as the Haitian Revolution with, sort of pitched battles in the streets at time, but it's still violent. And that violence has been glossed over. We remember Paul Revere's propaganda print of, execution-style British soldiers firing into the crowd rather than a horse being tarred and feathered. And I think Christian Barnes is a powerful reminder of this because she's a victim of this violence and the threat of this violence. And in fact, her portrait, if you've been looking at it, wondering what's wrong with the chest, that's not Prince Demah's fault. When the Barneses flee, Patriot soldiers come to commandeer their house, give it over to the use of Henry and Lucy Knox, which upsets Christian Barnes because she thinks Lucy Knox, who she knows, should know better than to take her things. And her portrait is bayoneted through the heart. And that is why it is like that to this day. So in the meantime, when the Barneses leave the United States, pre-United States, 1775, Prince Demah and Daphne stay behind. And they are self-emancipated. And Prince Demah, in fact, has already set up shop in Boston as a professional painter. He set up at the shop of a watchmaker called John McLean. He took out multiple advertisements in the Boston newspapers. And here I want to dwell on the fact, via Phyllis Wheatley, that he's not the only Black genius who lived in Boston. He's not even the only Black genius working in his neighborhood, because McLean's shop was on King Street near the State House that served as the backdrop for the Boston Massacre, and of course a short walk from the site of the corner of King and Mackerel, which is where a family called the Wheatleys, where Phyllis Wheatley lived, was located. And so to dwell on this even more, not only are Prince Demah and Phyllis Wheatley both working in London on creative endeavors at the same time, they both go, working in Boston rather, they both go to London to pursue them. Prince Demah because Copley won't train him on account of his race, Phyllis Wheatley because she can't get the backing she needs financially in Boston. So London is this important node of connection for them when they're working on these things. But I'd like to point out, this poem that inspired the title of my book is dedicated not to Prince Demah, but to SM, a young African painter, on seeing his work. And so SM is, of course, probably Scipio Moorhead, who also lives in the neighborhood. And while I think that it was Prince Demah who painted the portrait of Phyllis Wheatley that is the engraving upon which this is based in the frontispiece of her book. And the reason I think this is because knowing how carefully Phyllis Wheatley and Susanna Wheatley made sure that her image was exactly what they wanted it to be, I find it kind of astounding to think that they wouldn't have gone with the London-trained painter down the block who was advertising that his extraordinary genius had been recently assisted by one of the best masters in London, instead of Scipio Moorhead, who's likely a teenage boy who's been trained by his enslaver, but certainly hasn't gone to London. But we will never know this for sure, probably. But I think the extraordinary thing about this is that there's not one, not two, but three creative Black geniuses who are artists within shouting distance of one another during the 1770s in Boston. And the reason I want to dwell on this is I think it encourages us to stop this historical narrative that exceptional enslaved people, exceptional Black people, exceptional women in the 18th century are exceptional, that they are unique, because they are exceptional, but they're not unique. There are a lot of them. And I think it's a great reminder that artists will be artists as much as they can, regardless of the situations they find themselves in. And I think that Prince Demah is an inspiring reminder of that. This is one of the paintings that he paints in the early 1770s in Boston from Maclean's shop. This is William Duguid, who's a Scottish merchant. And what I love about this is it's signed on the back, and Prince Demah with a teeny tiny Barnes. And this is sort of a precursor to the fact that Demah is the name that his mother gave him, which was probably her surname in West Africa or her first name. And the two of them styled themselves as Daphne and Prince Demah after the Barnes' leave. And so I love the fact that Barnes is teeny tiny here. But the brooch that Duguid wears in the portrait, a symbol of love and affection in its jewels and its shape, descended with the family. So I think a really wonderful reminder that, to William Duguid and his family, it was just as good to get this London-trained, formerly enslaved painter as it was to get a more studied master. And so when the Barneses flee and Demah decides to enlist in the patriot cause, he enlists in a militia company known as the Train. So as I mentioned, he enlists with the surname Demah, and the Train was an interesting choice for him to make because it's kind of a famous military unit. It has notable connections to some of the great moments of the American Revolution. Its officers, for example, have been part of the greatest hits, defending the siege of Boston, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. Second in command is Paul Revere, who you see there in his portrait by Copley. And its commanding officer was Colonel Thomas Crafts. So Crafts, like Revere, had a long history of activism. He was a member of the Loyal Nine, the Sons of Liberty, participated in the Boston Tea Party. And it was he who read the Declaration of Independence out loud from the balcony of the State House when it made its way from Philadelphia to Boston for the first time. What's interesting about these officers, Revere and Crafts, is that they have something else in common besides their politics, and it's something they have in common with Prince Demah too. They're all artisans. Revere, of course, silver maker, printmaker. Crafts is a Japanner, so he's someone who paints furniture to make it look like Asian lacquered furniture, as in this example from the 1760s in Salem. And there are also other people in the unit. It's almost comical how many artisans there are, including a man called Dunkerley, whose miniature you see there on the right, surrounded by a frame made by Paul Revere, because Dunkerley was a British soldier who deserted out of principle, as he remembered, once things took a turn and enlisted to fight in the Train. And I think it's a wonderful example of how these loyalties can be very malleable in this time period. And Robert Edgepine is not the only Briton who comes to the American cause out of conviction and ideals. And so thinking of Robert Edgepine and his ideals is the fact that I always wonder if Robert Edgepine and Prince Demah corresponded while Prince Demah was enlisted in the Train. And one reason I wonder this is because we know Prince Demah was literate. We also know that at the same time that Prince Demah is sadly dying in 1778, leaving a will in which he leaves everything to his beloved mother, Daphne Demah, and remembers himself not as a soldier, but as an artist and a free man. Robert H. Pine is working on another painting that Demah would have liked, politically speaking, and that is an allegory called America, which is something that caused Robert H. Pine a lot of heat. It allegorically aligns America with peace and liberty and prosperity, and Great Britain is very much the bad guy. And this is this massive history painting that he makes into the print there. And what's fascinating about this is he raises a subscription, so gets monetary donations to have this print made. And you see a copy on the right of the subscription. So it's kind of a rare survival. That's at Mount Vernon. And intriguing because the person who's buying 5 copies of his print is George William Fairfax, a Virginian who also is rumored to be of African descent and happens to be besties with George Washington. And in fact, his copy of America does end up in Mount Vernon, where it's hanging today still in the dining room. And it is because of that connection with George William Fairfax that Robert H. Pine ends up going to America and gets the patronage of George and Martha Washington. But before I get to that, one of the last things he does before he packs up and goes to America is paint a portrait of his artistic acquaintance and family friend, Patience Wright, the wax sculptor, who you see there on the left. And you can see, I think, in this portrait in which she has this sort of mound under this diaphanous fold on her lap, that he's evoking her famous modeling system. And in fact, they are connected by family ties, friendly family ties, as well as artistic ones. So I love thinking about the fact that he chose to portray her this way. And then on the right, you see the things that made her famous. So these incredibly realistic wax figures. This is the only full-length one of hers that survives, and this is William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who was probably not as pro-American as Americans thought he was, but, they'd take the support where they could in the early days especially, and he famously collapsed on the floor of the House of Lords after standing up for the American cause yet again, and this was commissioned after his death. She'd already done a portrait of his head, but this was commissioned after his death, and it's so realistic you can see little hairs on the back of his hands. And he is, in fact, wearing the robes in which he collapsed and died. So this is this amazing survival. But, it is the only one of her full length that survived. But picture this, multiplied by dozens in multiple rooms in a wax museum in Pall Mall in London, which is what she operated in the 1770s and 80s. And because of her royal connections, because of her aristocratic connections, she very casually at one point writes that Lord Dunmore, whom she knew, comes over and is trying to convince her to change her mind about the war. He's not successful, but, not everyone's having a casual chat with Lord Dunmore about what's happening in the American Revolution. She is. And so during the Revolution, she becomes very active in helping American prisoners of war who were kept everywhere from the Tower of London to prisons in Plymouth, where conditions are so destitute they have no right to a trial because of a Treason Act. Conditions are so destitute they're doing things like eating snails off the walls. She's one of the prime voices raising money and support for them. And she also is engaged in espionage. So using her wax museum as a node of connection, she will gather intelligence, write to Benjamin Franklin, who at this point is in Paris, across the channel, write letters to Benjamin Franklin, and some letters she puts inside wax heads that she ships to her sister Rachel, who's operating a wax museum in Philadelphia that is popular among members of the Continental Congress. So they have this transatlantic espionage system. Now, I don't think she was a good spy. There are letters in the British Library where, from the sort of 18th century MI6, where they talk about how they've intercepted her letters to Franklin in Paris, but they're going to let them go through because some of her information is just so off base that it'll do more good than harm to let them pass. But nevertheless, she's out there. She is engaged in espionage. She's engaged in prisoner of war activism, all through the connections of her wax museum. And like Abigail Adams, she wants the ladies to be remembered. She writes to John Dickinson that women are always useful in grand events. And so again, I think a really powerful reminder that Abigail Adams is not the only woman in this era calling for more political, more legal, more representation, more of a voice for women. And she's certainly doing that and doing as much as she can. And so one of the things that happens with Patience Wright is that she understands the symbolic and instructive importance of art and how it can play a role in politics. And one of the things she wants to do after the war ends is she has this vision, and she hounds Thomas Jefferson about it. She hounds Benjamin Franklin. She hounds John Adams. She wants to create a full-sized wax museum in Independence Hall, as it now is, of all the great men who were part of the American Revolution. Now, regrettably, I think, she dies in London before this can happen. But, an amazing thing that she wanted to do. But at the time of her death, her acquaintance Robert Edge Pine had made it to America, and he does start to do the same thing she wanted to, but in paint, not wax. He paints George Washington. He paints multiple pictures of Martha Custis Washington's grandchildren and family members. And he's really notable for this extreme output. He paints anyone who's anyone. And important to note that at the time, he's the most important artist who's come to America. No other award-winning British artist has come to America. And so this is a big deal, and the Washingtons talk about how it's a big deal. One of the ways he's able to be so productive is that his artist daughters, including Charlotte, who you see there on the left, would help him with this very unusual technique he had. He would paint the head of the sitter, cut it out, paste it on another canvas, and then his daughters would finish the rest of it. And so, they're able to have this sort of production line portrait gallery going on. And I think this is one reason, too, that, Martha Washington has her grandchild, Eleanor, painted there. And to us, maybe this is not, the most accomplished looking American child's portrait. But when you bear in mind that the other portraits of children hanging at Mount Vernon are the Feral Children by John Wollaston, I think you can see the appeal. And in fact, a lot of important people in America do see the appeal, including Robert Morris, whose portrait by Pine you see here. And I should say Pine and daughters because voila, the technique, right? It's very obvious in that one. Robert Morris is so taken that he decides that he's going to build a mansion for the Pine family. And the second floor is going to be a gallery space. And in fact, this is what happens. And so with the encouragement of Robert Morris, he sets up, he has things like Houdin's bust of Franklin, which he stores there for safekeeping while he's off doing other things. He's got massive Shakespeare paintings, massive history paintings, scandalously the first copy of the Venus de Milo in America. All these things you can come and see. And Charles Willson Peele's son, Rembrandt, compares it overtly to his father's small art gallery, as he terms it, and says he's never seen anything so splendid in his life as the Pine Museum. And what Pine really wants to do is create history paintings, very realistic history paintings. This is his Congress voting independence. And those of you who know Independence State House will know that, or the hall rather, this is an accurate architectural rendering. And if you look at the faces and the calves and the bellies and the bodies and the hairlines, this has not been photoshopped. This is not a romanticized image, unlike John Trumbull's later iteration where you've got much higher ceilings, velvet swag everywhere, and the men all have shapely calves, much smaller bellies, and they've been filtered. So why does this matter? Robert Edge Pine dies, like Patience Wright, before he can complete his vision. And we can talk in the Q&A about what happens with his art. But most of it is lost to time and disaster. But I like to imagine how our understanding of the revolution and its patriots might have been altered had more of his art survived, had he, Patience Wright, and Prince Demah continued to keep making art long after the war ended. We'd have a gallery of lifelike colored wax figures of founders to rival Madame Tussauds. We'd have portraits by a formerly enslaved man who, like Trumbull, was also a London-trained patriot artist and military veteran. And I think the art of these three people would have created a very different visual memory of the American Revolution. And I think the intertwined lives of the patriots in this book remind us that the popular image of a patriot in the American Revolution, of a white man writing a political pamphlet or leading a battle charge within the continental United States, is an important part of the story, but it's only part of the story. And Revolutionary era patriotism was far more cosmopolitan, geographically broad, and diverse than it's often remembered to be. The patriots who dedicated themselves to the cause of American liberty included Black and mixed-race people, women, people from outside what became the national borders of the United States, and people who practiced idiosyncratic politics outside the bounds of elected office through art, popular culture, and espionage. And I think folding the transatlantic story of these creative patriots into the wider story of the nation's origins both complicates and enriches it. And as we approach the nation's 250th birthday in 2026, the lives traced in this book remind us that we must continue to revise our collective memory about who American patriots were, what they looked like, where they fought, and with what weapons. And I think if we reimagine what patriotism meant in this way during the American Revolution, doing so helps us better understand that world, but it also points us to places and things that allow us to have historical conversations that can move us forward together as a diverse nation. And so thank you for being part of one of those conversations tonight, and I look forward to our Q&A. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Zara. That was, I'm just going to say it, that was fire.
I love it. I love it.
So we'll just chat for a few minutes, and then I know you all will have questions, but I wanted to just start by just saying that the interconnections, and this may come out more in the book than in the talk, although it's pretty clear from the talk too, that the interconnections between the characters, but also with everyone else during this time is pretty amazing. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how you came to identify these three particular individuals to feature.
Yeah, so the Prince Demah Robert Edge Pine connection was done for me by a label at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So that was easy. Thank you, curators at the Met. But one of the things that struck me about that connection was that there's so much rich history there in terms of the Pine family and the fact that the Pine family included women artists as well as men, and this element of mixed race he himself had. None of that is mentioned in the Met's label. So it all sort of once I started doing some digging, and I am a historian of the Atlantic world, and I like the excuse to go to London to do research. So, I was like, well, this is amazing. This is a great connection. And because women are half of history, but not always half of history, I really wanted to make sure that women were part of this connection too. And so when I realized the connection between Patience Wright and Robert Edge Pine, not just in the portrait that he did of her, but in the fact that, for example, when her younger daughter, Phoebe, who's one of Benjamin West's favorite models, marries a Royal Academy trained artist called John Hopner, who is widely rumored to be the king's illegitimate son. He disowns him from his lifelong allowance after he marries the American spy's daughter. So, interesting. But so there are two witnesses at the wedding, and one of them is Robert Edge Pine's niece. So then I was like, okay, these people are much more connected. And they're also part of this pro-American community that's centered in Bath, England during the American Revolution, which includes Catherine Macaulay, George William Fairfax, Robert Edge Pine, and Patience Wright comes and summers there as well. So I just thought this is this amazing collection of just wildly bizarre, interesting. The other person at the wedding of her daughter, by the way, was her sometime assistant, a British military veteran who ordered himself to be buried upside down because he believed in the second coming of Christ. And when that happened, the world would be topsy-turvy, and this way he'd have a head start on everyone else. So this is a whole other thing, yes. And then together, he and Patience Wright she wrote a letter to Benjamin Franklin saying that they had raised 1,200 men who would be willing to fight through the streets of London to depose George III and put Franklin in his place. Franklin didn't take them up on it. But so these are the types of people, and so I just thought these people, and then on a more serious note, they are very self-consciously trying to be part of this American project, and they're not entirely successful. And I just thought the resonances with what has happened ever since with women and enslaved people and Black Americans and immigrants trying to get the liberties that are the amazing principles and natural rights promises that I think we all love in the Declaration of Independence, for example. But the fact that people have been asking for those rights, and some ways it's been failing them, I thought it was a really powerful way to think about the limits as well as the promise of the Revolutionary era.
I want to ask you about a term that you've used in your talk and you've used in the book. In fact, I think it's in two of your chapter titles, and that is genius.
Yes.
because I think they all were considered genius. And so I wondered if you could talk about what genius meant during this period, and if there's some sort of transatlantic component there. Just would like to hear you talk a little bit more about that during this period.
Yeah, so the two chapter titles that Nan is referencing, one is Black Genius and one is Ladies of Genius. And this is a good shorthand for discussing the fact that it was seen as possible for Black people and women to have genius in the 18th century. Robert H. Pine said he trained Prince Demah on account of his genius. Catherine Macaulay was talked about as a genius. Patience Wright was talked about as a genius. But at the same time, there is a limitation there. It's always sort of like they're a genius, but there's something a little bit off about their geniusness because...
Is it kind of a curiosity?
Sort of like a curiosity and sort of like a, well, they're not really a genius in quite the same way that a white man is a genius. And then people have different ideas about, partly this is because people have different ideas about whether genius needs to be trained or is inherent and innate. One of the whole raison d'etres behind the Royal Academy of Art, Sir Joshua Reynolds' raison d'etre is training genius is vitally important. And someone bought a copy of his Discourses on Art in which he talks about genius needing to be trained and wrote in the margins, this man is a knave. Anyone who thinks that genius is not innate but needs to be taught is a knave. And I think he bought the book just to rip on Sir Joshua Reynolds, which is funny. But this idea that certain people are more suited to be genius than others, and I think it's important. It's an important conversation politically because it plays into who is seen as having the special characteristics that would set you apart and make you eligible for all sorts of things. And so this is this double-edged sword for Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Demah and Patience Wright in really interesting ways.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask, I'm keeping an eye on the time, but I do want you to say a little bit about the sources you use because as you mentioned, as you point out, for these three individuals, their creativity, their art, so much of it is lost to us, submerged, or and you can talk about what happened to some of the paintings, if you like, and the wax sculptures, but because we don't have the body of work to draw on, and because they all died pretty prematurely, I would say, right? Mm-hmm. So what kinds of sources did you find useful to tell these important stories?
Yeah, it's so tantalizing, isn't it, to just be able to describe this wonderful piece of art, for example, the decapitated head of Charles I, instead of show you the image. Although I've imagined it many times. But so I think this is part of, it's a reminder that sometimes history is remembered certain ways because people manufacture it certain ways, and sometimes it's just an accident of time, and things are absent, and so they fall through the historical cracks. And I think that's the case for their art. For the most part, because Robert H. Pine, when he dies with this, massive Robert Morris financed art museum in Philadelphia, his wife operates it for a while. She also operates a school for girls. And again, to give you a hint of how important these people were at the time, pupils in her school include Ben Franklin's granddaughter and Thomas Jefferson's younger daughter. So, they're very highly regarded. But she decides it's too much. She closes shop, and she and her daughters move back to England. But the Pennsylvania state legislature does not want it to be sold at auction because they want to keep it intact. They're like, this is the beginning of a national art collection, and it needs to stay intact. So sort of like a proto-Smithsonian. For financial reasons, it eventually falls through, and a guy called Daniel Bowen buys it. He also, weirdly, buys Elizabeth Wright, who's Patience Wright's older daughter, and has operated a wax museum in New York City since the war ended. He buys her wax museum, which includes some of her mother and aunt's things, combines them all together as Daniel Bowen's, wax works and paintings exhibition, has it in Philadelphia, then has it in Boston, where thousands of people go to see it. It's a very popular attraction. And then in 1803, it all goes up in flames together. So, so bizarre to think of all of their things collected together in one place and then they go up in flames. Prince Demah, meanwhile, I'm 100% certain there's other art that exists in people's attics and hanging on walls in Massachusetts, et cetera.
Just not signed.
And just not signed, and people just don't know.
Yeah.
But so the reason I think that is because, like all of these people, I found a lot of the documentation about these things, about this art, in letters, in newspapers, in account books. And for me, it was a really great reminder that, I was trained, I worked in museums, did architectural field work, I worked with the existing stuff, right? But I think it's a really good reminder that we can find things in archival documentation, just like we can find little snippets of references to enslaved people's existence or women's ideas about things, and we can build out whole worlds from that. And so I think it is a good reminder of, historical detective work that can pay off, even for something like art, which we don't think of as requiring as much detective work, I think.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, let's open things up to our audience, both our audience on YouTube in the back, and Laura and Havlis will be monitoring that. And then for you all in the room, Scott Casper is going to be running around with the microphone. If you do have a question, raise your hand, and Scott will come to you with the microphone. This is not what presidents should be doing, but it is what he's doing. We're teamwork here. So that way the folks on YouTube can hear your question if anyone has one in the room.
Quick question. Pine painted that painting in Independence Hall in the 1770s?
1780s, yes.
But Trumbull did too. Trumbull's was later in the 80s, right?
Trumbull's was later, yes. And so if you look at the, if you compare them side by side, there are some figures I think Trumbull copied from Robert Edge Pines, because Robert Edge Pines, the reason we have that is a guy called Edward Savage made a print copy of it. And so that was, that survived. And so a print, of course, is easy to get your hands on. And so Trumbull, there are certain figures like Roger Sherman is pretty much a shoo-in in the Trumbull for the pine. But so it's a fascinating look at how these artists are all talking to each other to create these images of the revolution. Yeah.
Thank you.
We had a clarifying question coming in from one of our YouTube viewers. You mentioned that there were 3 Black geniuses living in close proximity in Boston. Besides Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Demah, who was that third genius?
The third was Scipio Moorhead, who was also, according to documentation and Phyllis Wheatley's poem dedicated to him, a skilled painter. And this makes historical sense because his enslaver was a woman who sometimes taught skills like japanning and other forms of painterly hobbies, so to speak. And so he also had access to that kind of training and materials. But Phyllis Wheatley's mention of it is the real reason that we know of it. So, very tantalizing again, because unlike Prince Demah and Phyllis Wheatley, whose eventual fates we know, Scipio Moorhead was sadly sold at auction to finance family debts when his enslavers, the parents died. He was sold by the children, and he just disappears from the historic record. So it's, a sad reminder of how, while they all were creative geniuses on a certain level, they did face these really horrible obstacles because of the fact that they were enslaved.
Hello. Speaking of detective work, how did you uncover that Robert Edge Pine was a person of color?
So it is, I think the best evidence is that portrait of his father, John Pine, by William Hogarth. And he doesn't just appear to be of African descent in his features and his hair, et cetera, but Hogarth is using a lot of visual clues that people attach to Black figures in the 18th century, a turban and a pearl earring. That's not something that, it's just a common sort of iconographical symbol that is used by Hogarth, among others. And there also are persistent rumors over time and at the time in the 18th century, but John Pine was a Mason. The Masons believed that he was, for the most part, of African descent. And then Robert Edge Pine's family, when they're in Philadelphia, one of the people who knew them then remembers them as a diminutive family. They were apparently all very small, but he remembers them as a family of pygmies. So there's, again, this sort of racial slur associated with the family. So it's really interesting because, of course, race is more fluid in the 18th century in terms of ideas about it in some ways than it was in the 19th century. But so I think Robert Edge Pine was telling George Washington he was of mixed race? No. But do I think that this rumor, that there's some legs behind it because it's persistent and we have other bits of evidence? I do, yeah.
Hi. So I was intrigued by the broadside subscription proposal that we saw in there. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the business of being an artist in general and the marketing of being an artist in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that that broadside survives because that's the type of ephemera that often doesn't,
Yeah.
and it survives in collections like this, which is fantastic. So if you are an artist and you have created this massive history painting and you want more people to see it than come to, the room where it's on display for a couple months a year or your studio or whatever, you want to get a print made. And so prints are the most easily reproduced, widely disseminated form of art in the time. And so what he was getting a subscription for was to get the engraving made and then reproduced. And so having people like George William Fairfax sign up to say, I'm going to give you £8 to pay for this. If you get so many of those people, then you can pay for it to be done. And Phyllis Wheatley, by the way, was trying to do the same thing initially when she was trying to get her book of poems published in Boston. So there are subscriptions for books as well as for art. But this is, something that one of the reasons that Robert H. Pine is such a coup for the Washingtons to have, and I think one of the reasons Robert Morris builds him a museum, is because he was very savvy in terms of his business because so many of his paintings were made into prints. And, not just John Wilkes and Catherine Macaulay, but even the, Earl of Warren in 1278 refusing to give up his sword. That's not exactly like, a story that's tumbling off of it's not like the hot new gossip, right? It's tumbling off of everyone's lips. But he knows enough to get it made into a print. And I think that's part of his really, his father was an engraver. And so, he's part of that world. So it's a very savvy business decision. It's also one that Paul Revere's engaged in, right? And so it's happening on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's a way that painters and printmakers try to make more money than they would just on a one-off piece of art. And it's also the way a common visual culture is created, right? Because people will have this shared understanding of what John Wilkes looks like or what they think the Boston Massacre looked like. So I think that there's a politics to this business too when people want it to be that way.
We have another question from our online audience. Was there any formal censorship in place vis-a-vis the dissemination of some of these prints or images?
It's a great question. So censorship is, of course, linked to ideas about freedom of the press and ideas about free speech. And it is something that is, on the British side of things, very dicey during the American Revolution because one of the things that happens in the beginning of the war, so 1775, is that British politicians are not sure what they want to do about this. They're not sure if they want to try to make every American who's engaged in protest or rebellion, subject to accusations of treason or not, because this opens a whole can of legal worms, among other things. So one of the things that happens, for example, is Patience Wright's other son-in-law, in addition to the one rumored to be the illegitimate son of George III, is a guy called Ebenezer Smith Platt. And Ebenezer Smith Platt is arrested in Jamaica for being involved in a privateer seizure of a British ship off the coast of Georgia. And he ends up arrested by the Navy, shuttled across the Atlantic, moved from ship to ship on the Atlantic and then in the harbor in England so that an attorney can't find him and issue a writ of habeas corpus, which would enable him to stand trial. And the reason I'm linking this to censorship is that he eventually gets to shore, and the Treason Act of 1777 has just been passed. And it means that anyone who is engaged in treasonous activity in the United States of America or on the high seas can be imprisoned without the right to trial indefinitely at the king's pleasure. And so he becomes this cause célèbre, and he eventually marries Patience Wright's other daughter, Elizabeth. So her family is just crazy in terms of who's in it. But the censorship comes up because people are trying to agitate on his behalf. John Wilkes is a big champion of his. Benjamin Franklin's a big champion. Patience Wright's a big champion. There's a pamphlet, and I've only seen one copy of it. It exists at the American Philosophical Society. Right, it's huge. Writing up his case, it's like a 4-sided pamphlet and it's not signed. There's no printer's name attached to it. That is unusual. And the reason it's not signed and there's no printer's name attached is because no one wants to be associated with this pamphlet that's talking about this guy who's being held for treason. So some of the censorship is actually self-censorship in that respect. The first print made of George Washington in London in the 1770s, the name attached to it is a totally fictitious person, because even maybe showing an image of George Washington would be a little bit too much. So it's not so much, there are obvious times when the Crown comes after people like John Wilkes for publishing incendiary things in his publication, The North Briton. There are many more times, I think, where it's self-censorship, where you're trying to avoid getting dragged into this, I mean, people end up in the Tower of London, right? It's a crazy time.
Well, Zara, what I love about both your works, you have, and I think this is both of the subtitles, hidden histories, forgotten histories. You're so good at that, and I probably shouldn't ask this question, but what are you looking at next? Do you know what the next project? This has just come off, so you don't have to answer this. But I'm curious.
No, I like all of us, I have a lot of things I'm interested in, but I think I know we don't have much time, so I think I will just say my next project is inspired by something I talk about a very little bit in the book, but you'll see an image of it, and it's a wax baby, allegedly of the wax baby of the Dauphin of France that was bought by a Nantucket whaler from French nuns in the 1780s, and it's now ended up at the Whaling Museum in Nantucket. So baby wax Dauphin is my inspiration for my next project, is all I'm going to say.
That's excellent.
And it's not really about wax, it's more about Nantucket and France, so yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been
Thank you.
so
It's been so
enlightening,
fun.
and thank you. For those of you who are interested in a copy, we have our friends from Tidepool Books are out in the alcove at the library selling books, and Zara has said that she'd be happy to sign.
Yes, thank you.
And I want to let you all know about our next program, which is actually this week, Thursday evening at 7 p.m. This will be a virtual program with Susanna Ashton, who will be speaking on her new book called A Plausible Man, the story of the slave who escaped slave that Uncle Tom's Cabin was based upon. So that's really great. This is, again, a virtual program, so go to our website to register for that so that you'll get the link to join the program. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And thank you,
Thank you.
Zara.
Thank you all for coming. It's great. Thanks.